She stopped him with a rule. He answered with a promise. What would you do if the man you just lectured about workplace protocol turned out to be the new CEO Eleanor Baker had worked for years to earn her place, steady, invisible, and reliable in a world that rarely made room for women like her to shine? She had rules, boundaries, a desk she guarded like a fortress. Then, one morning, he walked in. No badge, no introduction, just quiet power, wrapped in a tailored coat. And when she stood up to him, she thought it would be the end. Instead, it was the beginning. This is not a story about grand gestures or whirlwind romance. It's about small acts of grace, about the tension between pride and vulnerability, and about the love that waits patiently, quietly, for you to be ready. If you've ever doubted your worth, if you've ever loved from a distance, or if you've ever wondered whether someone truly saw you, this story is for you. Leave a comment if this touched your heart, and don't forget to subscribe for more soulful stories every week. Now, take a breath. Let's begin. He walked past the front desk, past the security gate, past her. No ID, no words, no respect. And Eleanor Baker had had enough. It was barely 8:15 on a Monday morning, and the air in the lobby still smelled faintly of lemon polish and burnt coffee. The city was waking up slowly, Seattle's early spring rain brushing against the tall glass windows like a polite reminder that the sun wouldn't be making an appearance today. Eleanor liked mornings like these. They were quiet, dependable, and full of potential, just like the spreadsheets she kept lined up in her inbox by priority level. Her black pumps tapped steadily against the stone floor as she crossed the open space toward her desk. High heels not for style, but precision. She believed every detail mattered. Her workspace was already organized, laptop open, files sorted, to-do list, handwritten in blue ink, order in chaos. That was her gift. She was reaching for her first sip of lukewarm coffee when she noticed him, tall, purposeful, and walking like he owned the place. He had entered through the front doors without a badge, she was certain of that. He hadn't checked in at reception, no badge swipe, no pause, just one smooth, uninterrupted path straight toward the executive wing like he'd done it 1,000 times. Except he hadn't. Eleanor stood up slowly. Her first thought was consultant. Maybe someone from legal or IT. She had seen plenty of men like that before, men who thought protocols were suggestions and receptionists were furniture. But this wasn't a man she recognized, and Eleanor Baker didn't allow strangers into the executive corridor. Not on her watch. She stepped around her desk, heels clicking with quiet command. "Excuse me," she said, voice firm but polite. "That wing is restricted access. You'll need to check in before proceeding." The man didn't stop walking, didn't even slow. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Sir," she called again, louder this time. "You need clearance to enter beyond this point." Only then did he pause, just steps away from the glass double doors leading to the executive suites. He turned not hastily, not apologetically, but slowly, as though mildly inconvenienced by being addressed. He was older than she was, probably mid-40s, charcoal gray suit, tailored perfectly, black coat draped over one arm. His face was unreadable, but his presence was striking, like someone accustomed to walking into rooms where decisions were made. Still, Eleanor didn't flinch. "I'm asking for your ID," she said again. Slower this time. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers twitched slightly against the folder she still held. "No one is allowed into that corridor without security clearance." There was a pause. Not awkward, but weighted. He studied her, really studied her, and she felt it like a slow ripple across her skin. Not predatory, just measured. as if he were deciding whether she was worth a response. Then, without a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small black card case. From it, he slid out a single business card and extended it toward her. She took it before thinking. Charles Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, Redstone Ventures, Seattle, WA. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. She blinked once, then twice. The card didn't change. This man she had just tried to block, scold, and possibly report to security wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a consultant. He was the new owner, the CEO, the man who had bought out the company's previous executive board just weeks ago. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She could feel the warmth rising in her cheeks like embarrassment boiling up through her chest. But Charles Whitmore didn't mock her. Didn't look smug. He simply returned the card case to his pocket and said in a calm, almost thoughtful tone, "I appreciate people who do their jobs with conviction." Then he nodded once and turned back toward the executive wing. Eleanor didn't follow. Couldn't. Her heels suddenly felt heavier, her breath tighter. The silence he left behind was louder than any reprimand she had expected. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't laughed, hadn't said more than 12 words. But those 12 words carried weight, and something else, something she couldn't name yet. A kind of respect, maybe, or warning. She stood there long after he disappeared into the corridor, still holding his business card between her fingers. The paper felt thick and smooth, expensive, real. Behind her, the office hummed to life. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, the coffee machine hissed with discontent. But Eleanor felt slightly off axis, like the floor had shifted half an inch beneath her feet. She had prepared herself for difficult clients, for arrogant managers, for budget cuts and board meetings and broken printers, but nothing had prepared her for him. As she finally returned to her desk, she slid the card into the top drawer, shut it slowly, and stared at her screen without reading a word. She told herself it was just another Monday, but deep down she knew something had changed, and by tomorrow morning she'd know just how much. He didn't fire her, he didn't avoid her, but he watched her always quietly, always from a distance. Eleanor had expected consequences. Not dramatic, perhaps, but definite. She had mentally rehearsed an apology, drafted an email she never sent, and avoided eye contact every time the elevator chimed behind her desk. She thought she'd at least be pulled into HR, or perhaps, worse, ignored completely. Instead, nothing happened, or so she thought. The morning after their encounter, Charles Whitmore didn't storm past her. He didn't look at her with disapproval or mild amusement. He didn't offer a nod or a glance. He simply walked past as if their exchange the day before had been routine, expected. But Eleanor felt anything but ordinary. Her pride remained intact, but her certainty frayed at the edges. She found herself second-guessing every sentence she typed, every hallway conversation, every minor protocol she enforced. And yet, beneath the nerves was something more perplexing, a flicker of curiosity. Who was this man who said so little, but carried himself like a thunderstorm held at bay? Days passed, and the office adjusted to its new leadership, though most employees had never seen the CEO up close. Rumors circulated. He was a Wall Street ghost, a corporate fixer, a man who built, broke, and bought companies like puzzle pieces. But Eleanor watched in quiet astonishment as change began to bloom in corners of the company no one else noticed. The fourth-floor printer, long plagued by jam errors, was suddenly replaced. The perpetually flickering lights in the women's restroom fixed overnight. The onboarding materials for new hires, which Eleanor had suggested revising nearly 6 months ago, were updated, professionally printed, and distributed with zero fanfare. And then came the proposals. Every document she had submitted in the past year marked pending review or deferred was suddenly marked approved. Not all at once, but in a steady stream, like someone had opened a hidden door and let air into a long, stale room. Eleanor said nothing. Of course. She wasn't the type to assume credit or fish for recognition, but she noticed, and it unsettled her, because whoever was reading those reports was paying attention. One Thursday evening, long after most of the staff had left, Eleanor stayed behind to finish quarterly reporting. She liked the silence of late hours, less noise, less small talk, just her, the quiet hum of office lights, and the familiar rhythm of her typing, until her computer froze. Not the kind of freeze that resolved itself, the kind that mocked her effort, locking her out of unsaved files and hours of work. Her jaw clenched. She had saved 3 versions already. It shouldn't have failed. She muttered under her breath, massaging her temples. "Try Task Manager first," a voice said behind her. She turned, startled. Charles stood in the doorway of her office alcove, sleeves rolled up, no tie, holding a bottle of water. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man who had forgotten what time it was. His expression was calm, observing, not judging. She started, instinctively minimizing the screen, embarrassed. But he was already moving. Without asking permission, he walked around her desk, leaned slightly over her shoulder, and began typing with swift precision. His hands moved with muscle memory, efficient and unhurried. A few keystrokes later, the system unfroze. Her lost data flickered back onto the screen. Eleanor blinked, her throat tightened with unexpected relief. "How did you?" she began. "I read its weekly reports," he replied simply, straightening. "The system's been unstable since the last update." She looked up at him then, not as the man who owned the company, not as the stranger she had once reprimanded, but as someone who noticed more than he let on. "Thank you," she said, quieter than intended. He didn't respond right away, just offered a small nod, placed the bottle of water on her desk, and turned to leave. At the threshold, he paused. "People like you," he said, without turning around, "keep things running long before the titles catch up." Then he was gone. Eleanor sat still for a long moment. The cursor blinked on her screen, waiting for her next move. But her thoughts weren't on spreadsheets anymore. They were on a man who spoke little, but noticed everything. And for the first time, Eleanor began to wonder, not with fear, but with something softer, more curious. Who is Charles Whitmore, really? The first cup appeared on a rainy Monday. Her favorite blend, no note, no name. But she knew exactly who sent it. It was the kind of Seattle morning that made even the streetlights feel tired, rainy, gray, reluctant. The city outside was wrapped in mist, and everything inside felt just a bit slower. Eleanor arrived early, as usual. The building was mostly quiet, save for the soft whir of HVAC and the low hum of fluorescent lighting. She removed her coat, set down her umbrella, and turned to her desk. The cup was waiting there, simple, white, unbranded, but warm to the touch. And the smell. French roast with a splash of oat milk and a hint of cinnamon. Her usual order, not common enough to be a guess. She looked around. No one. She checked her calendar. No meetings until 9. She hadn't mentioned craving coffee to anyone lately. Not out loud, anyway. But then her eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the executive corridor. The door was closed. Quiet. Still, she knew. And the strangest part wasn't the coffee. It was the fact that something so small could make her feel seen. It didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, Eleanor noticed more changes. Not corporate-wide announcements or sweeping policy shifts, but smaller, subtler adjustments. Things that could have been coincidence if they hadn't been so personal. The squeaky chair in her cubicle replaced. Same design, same style, just better, ergonomic, stable. The kind you didn't notice until your back stopped hurting at the end of the day. The stack of leadership books she'd once borrowed from the dusty company library, now restocked, reorganized, and somehow expanded with titles she had once offhandedly mentioned in passing, including the memoir she'd been meaning to read but could never justify buying. And then there was the elevator. She usually shared it with interns, managers, people rushing between meetings, but on several quiet mornings, she stepped in and found herself alone until, just before the doors closed, Charles would slip in silently, nod politely, and stand beside her, never speaking, never crowding, but always present. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It wasn't even admiration. It was attention, quiet, unspoken attention. And for a woman like Eleanor, who'd spent years blending into boardrooms, being called efficient but rarely essential, it felt oddly tender. The shift came during an all-hands staff meeting one Thursday. The company had been undergoing structural evaluations under Charles's direction. New teams formed, old ones restructured. There was tension, curiosity, fear. People were eager to impress, but cautious. Eleanor had helped prepare the logistics for the meeting, as always, slides, printouts, nameplates. But when the agenda was distributed that morning, her name was listed under Presentation 3 Mentorship Program Proposal. She hadn't submitted the proposal for formal review. It had been part of a suggestion she'd attached to a quarterly report, barely more than a brainstorm. She blinked at the screen, then reread the line. Mentorship Program, presented by Eleanor Baker, Administrative Lead. Her pulse ticked up. No one had told her. No one had asked. She scanned the room. Charles sat at the head of the long table, reviewing his notes, calm, composed, not looking at her, but she knew. And this time, she didn't retreat. She stood. At first, her voice felt tight. Too many eyes. Too little warning. But once she began, it all came back: months of informal training she'd given new hires, notes she'd taken, the gaps she'd seen in onboarding, her own journey, coming into the company without guidance, learning by fire. As she spoke, the room changed. People leaned in. Heads nodded. One of the newer managers, asked a follow-up question. Then another. By the time she sat down, her hands were only slightly trembling. She didn't look at Charles, not until the meeting ended and everyone began gathering their things. Then, just as she turned to leave, he passed by, not stopping, not slowing, but pausing just long enough to say two quiet words, "Well done." And then he was gone. Back at her desk, the usual chaos resumed, emails pinging, messages piling up, meetings being rescheduled. But Eleanor sat still for a moment, the world moving around her like a blurred time-lapse. It wasn't the compliment. Not really. It was the feeling. The unmistakable, heart-quieting realization that for once, someone had seen her not as an assistant, not as background support, but as a voice worth amplifying. She didn't know what to do with that realization yet. Didn't know whether to lean into it or run from it. After all, attention from a man like Charles Whitmore wasn't just attention, it was a ripple effect, and she wasn't sure what part of her life it might disturb. But she also knew something else. He hadn't said much. He hadn't needed to. Because sometimes a cup of coffee on a rainy Monday says more than a dozen rehearsed compliments ever could. And the next time it showed up still warm, still perfect, she didn't even look around. She just smiled. She walked in wearing red heels and an even sharper smile. And suddenly, Eleanor wasn't so sure where she stood anymore. It was a Wednesday midweek, mid-morning, and midway through what Eleanor thought had been a period of quiet progress. Things had settled into a rhythm, reports were on time, teams were functioning. Charles, though still distant, was consistent in his silent gestures of approval. Eleanor had even let herself breathe. But everything shifted the moment Margaret Dean stepped off the elevator. She didn't need to announce herself. She didn't have to. The room shifted around her, tall, poised, confident in the way only people born into high expectations could be. Her tailored cream blazer hugged her figure, and her red heels clicked across the floor like punctuation marks. Her lipstick matched the shoes, intentional, controlled, elegant. Eleanor had only seen her in photos once, an old article about Redstone's former board of directors, but there was no mistaking her now. Margaret Dean, former investment partner of Charles Whitmore, and, as the office whispers quickly confirmed, once his fiancée. No one said it outright. They didn't have to. She wasn't here for a casual visit. By lunchtime, the announcement came. Margaret had been appointed strategic advisor to assist in the company's restructuring initiative. Temporary, of course, but even the word temporary held a weight that felt permanent. Charles made the announcement himself. Brief, neutral, impersonal. But when Margaret stepped up beside him, smiled, and thanked him for the opportunity to collaborate once again, Eleanor felt a tightness behind her ribs that no deep breath could fix. The changes came swiftly. Meetings, once coordinated by Eleanor, were now scheduled through Margaret's assistant. Documents she used to review for Charles never even crossed her desk. Her calendar, once full of quiet influence behind the scenes, began to hollow out. She told herself it was fine, logical. Margaret had more experience, more authority, more everything. But logic didn't soothe the sting, especially not the sting that came with watching Margaret slide seamlessly into spaces Eleanor had helped build, leading project reviews, calling team huddles, even sipping from Charles's favorite coffee mug in the break room like she belonged there. Eleanor stayed silent, professional. She smiled. She adapted. Until the hallway moment. It was late in the afternoon. The building had emptied out, and the echo of Eleanor's heels down the corridor was the only sound until she turned the corner and nearly ran into Margaret. They both stopped. Margaret tilted her head slightly, like someone inspecting something she already knew she wouldn't buy. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You're Eleanor?" she said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor gave a small nod. Yes. Margaret glanced down at the folder in Eleanor's hands, quarterly feedback reports, her own notes included. Then back up. "You're very efficient," she said. "Charles values that." The way she said his name, Charles, was effortless, familiar, like she still had a key to somewhere Eleanor didn't even know existed. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, measured. Margaret stepped closer, just enough to make the space feel intentional. "But let me offer a little advice," she continued, voice smooth as silk. "There's a difference between being respected and being indispensable. Stay in your lane, and you'll be just fine." She didn't wait for a response. The heels clicked again. Eleanor remained frozen, gripping the folder tight enough to wrinkle the edges. It wasn't what Margaret said. It was that, deep down, a part of her believed it. Over the next few days, the air around Eleanor changed. People still greeted her, still asked for her input, but their eyes drifted to Margaret when decisions were being made. Conversations she once led, she now simply attended. Proposals she wrote came back untouched. No edits, no feedback, just silence. Charles, for his part, remained as he always had, calm, quiet, polite, but distant. Too distant. There were no more coffees, no more hallway nods, no more paperbacks placed on the shared bookshelf, just meetings. And Margaret. Eleanor kept telling herself it was just business, temporary restructuring, a logical shift. But logic didn't quiet the ache of feeling. Erased. One afternoon, she stood at the corner of the team huddle area, watching Margaret point out revisions on a project Eleanor had originally designed. No one asked her opinion. No one looked her way. And in that moment, a sharp realization settled in her chest like a stone. She was disappearing. Slowly, neatly, like she'd never been essential to begin with. That evening, as she packed up her things, she paused at her drawer. Inside, tucked beneath office supplies, was the business card she hadn't looked at in weeks. Charles Whitmore, CEO. She traced the raised print with the tip of her finger, her mind drifting not to the man himself, but to that first moment. The confrontation, the quiet nod, the way he had said, "I appreciate people who do their jobs with conviction." Where had that man gone? And more importantly, where had she gone? The next morning, she arrived early again, not for work, not for habit, but to see if just for a moment whether the coffee would still be waiting. It wasn't. And Eleanor, standing alone by her desk, stared at the empty space and finally allowed herself to admit she missed being seen. She wrote the email late at night, alone in her apartment. Just 12 words, but it felt like burying a part of herself. The city outside her window blurred into streaks of rain and quiet horns. It was nearly midnight. The glow from her laptop was the only light in the room, casting long shadows on stacks of books and half-finished cups of tea. Eleanor sat still, curled in her old chair near the window, one blanket around her legs, and a weight far heavier across her chest. The email had been open for over an hour. Subject line typed, body waiting, cursor blinking like a silent heartbeat. She'd rewritten the message 6 times. The first version had been too emotional, the second too cold, the third read like a formal press release, the fourth tried to explain, the fifth apologized, the sixth, it just said the truth. When the place you gave your best no longer sees you, maybe it's time to go build your own. 12 words, nothing more. But they echoed through her chest like thunder in an empty room. She didn't hit send, not yet. Instead, she leaned back, rubbed her tired eyes, and let herself feel everything she had been pushing aside for weeks. It hadn't started with cruelty. There had been no single moment of betrayal, just small shifts. The mentorship proposal that had once made her feel respected, now shelved. Its progress halted. The meetings where her ideas used to be heard, now held without her. The brief glances from Charles that once felt reassuring, now fewer, shorter, more distant, as if he were watching a version of her slowly being erased, but didn't know how or didn't want to stop it. And then there was Margaret, effortless, charming, confident, and entirely comfortable in a space Eleanor had once quietly made her own. It wasn't Margaret's fault, really. But it was her presence that made Eleanor feel like a placeholder in her own story. The way she moved through the building, familiar with everything. The way Charles listened to her, nodded at her, sometimes even smiled at her. The kind of smile Eleanor hadn't seen in weeks. She had tried to stay composed, tried not to let it show, but no one noticed she stopped speaking up in meetings. No one asked why she left the break room a little earlier each day. No one noticed the way she started arriving later, leaving sooner. Even Tracy, always observant, had only said, softly, "You seem tired, Elle. Tired." That was the safe word. But what she felt was something deeper. Not exhaustion, invisibility. She thought of the morning she'd first met Charles, how fiercely she had spoken, how clear her voice had been, and how it had mattered. Back then, her presence had weight. Her words had shape. Now, it was like speaking into a void where no echo came back. She'd always believed that if you worked hard, stayed humble, respected the process, someone would notice. But now, she realized, being noticed wasn't the same as being valued, and no one, not even Charles, had fought for her place when it began to fade. Maybe he was just being professional. Maybe he didn't see what was happening. Or maybe, Eleanor thought bitterly, he simply didn't care anymore. That was the hardest possibility of all. She stood up from her chair and walked into the kitchen. There was a chipped mug on the counter, one Charles had given her during a company holiday exchange. "You're the calm in the chaos," it had said in small navy letters. She used to drink from it every morning. Now, it just sat there, cold, empty. She turned it upside down in the sink, and just like that, she knew she wouldn't go back. The next morning, she woke early, not for work, but for clarity. She brewed her own coffee black, no sugar, and sat on the balcony with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as Seattle's mist rolled in over the skyline. There was a certain stillness to mornings like that, a kind of honesty in the grayness, as if the world was telling her it was okay to feel what she was feeling, to start over. At 6:47, she opened her laptop again. Her resignation letter was still there, unsent. This time, she didn't hesitate. She added her name. No formalities, no attachment, just truth. She clicked send, and then she sat back and exhaled. A long, quiet breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for months. She arrived at the office early one last time. No one else had come in yet. She moved through the halls like a ghost, gathering only what mattered: her notebooks, a framed photo of her father, the small compass paperweight, and the cactus on her windowsill that had somehow survived 3 winters and a summer blackout. She left behind everything else: her badge, her ID, and a printed copy of her letter, folded neatly beneath the compass. As she walked out, she passed the empty reception desk. The elevator chimed softly. No coffee waited on her desk that day. No quiet nods, no questions, just the city waking up behind the glass, and Eleanor, stepping into the world with no plan, no safety net, but with something she hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Freedom to be seen somewhere else, freedom to matter on her own terms, freedom to build something that no one could take from her. She didn't cry, but as the elevator doors closed and the office disappeared behind polished steel, she whispered something only she could hear. "Thank you for showing me I still care, because even in heartbreak, there is clarity, and even in leaving, there is love." She didn't know if she was running from something or running to something, but the center needed her, and that was enough for now. The first morning she showed up, the air smelled like yesterday's coffee and old paper. The Women's Entrepreneurship Resource Center sat nestled between a closed bookstore and a laundromat that hummed through the day. The windows were smudged, the paint peeling, the chairs creaked when you sat down. The printer worked if you spoke kindly to it, but inside there was warmth, a kind of quiet, practical hope that reminded Eleanor of home before everything became spreadsheets and silence. Nobody asked for her resume. Nobody questioned why someone with corporate polish showed up in rolled-up sleeves and worn flats. They just gave her a folding chair and said, "Help where you can." And so she did. By day 3, Eleanor had memorized the layout: the crooked hallway that always caught her hip, the flickering light above the counseling room, the corner with the water-stained ceiling that still held meetings for women pitching their first ideas. There was Maria, who sold handmade soaps and dreamed of opening her own shop. Denise, who had 3 kids and a business plan scrawled on napkins. And Jolene, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in 2 months but showed up every day with notebooks full of thoughts. Eleanor didn't try to lead. She offered suggestions gently, helped translate thoughts into grant applications, reorganized the back room to create space for a lending library, bought a box of pens and Post-its from her own wallet because small things matter. She felt something waking up inside her. Not ambition. Not the need to prove herself. Something quieter. Like belonging. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage cabinet, she found an old whiteboard with half-erased goals scrawled across it in fading red ink. Child Care Support Legal Aid Workshops, Microloan Fund for First-Time Founders. She traced the words with her fingers. These weren't just dreams. They were survival strategies. She thought of all the meetings she'd sat in at Redstone, watching budget lines grow fatter in departments that didn't need them, of all the voices that had been too soft to be heard in boardrooms filled with people who never had to count coupons or ride the bus. And she remembered an email, one she'd written late one night weeks ago, back when hope still flickered. It had been addressed to Charles. Subject line: Alternative Support Models for Women in Transition. She'd attached a small, rough proposal. Nothing formal, just a few pages with ideas, loosely framed suggestions for programs like these. She'd never received a reply, not even a read receipt. She had assumed it went into the void, like so many other things. Until the envelope arrived. It came in quietly, delivered to the center's cracked mailbox with no return address. Inside was a typed letter from a law firm, dry official, stamped with legal formalities. The contents were anything but ordinary. A private donor, choosing to remain anonymous, had pledged funding for a full renovation of the community meeting space, 3-year operational support for microfinancing programs, funding for startup mentorship initiatives and legal workshops. No strings, no board seats, no naming rights. Just a simple note at the bottom, to be used where it matters most. In the hands of those who care. The room had gone still as the center's director read it aloud, eyes wide, hands trembling. When she looked up, Eleanor sat frozen because she recognized every item on that list. They were her words, her bullet points, her dreams, typed, formatted, granted. That night, she sat in her apartment, the letter spread across the kitchen table, her tea forgotten and going cold again. Could it be? She told herself no. It wasn't possible. Lots of people cared about women's causes. Wealthy donors gave all the time. But the phrasing, the timing, the specificity. A thought slipped in, unwelcome, uncertain, and far too hopeful. Charles. Could he have read it? Had he seen past the silence she left behind and done something when she no longer could? She didn't want to believe it. Hope was dangerous. She had just started breathing again. But still, that night, as she crawled into bed, she folded the letter and placed it in her nightstand drawer. Not for evidence, for safekeeping. Because sometimes, not knowing was softer than knowing. And some beginnings were too fragile to name. The next morning, the center buzzed with new energy. Plans were drafted, paint samples picked, a whiteboard ordered to replace the old one. And Eleanor, still wearing her name tag written in permanent marker, found herself asked gently but earnestly if she would consider helping lead the new development program. "You're good at holding space," Maria told her. "And you listen. You make people feel like their ideas aren't silly." Eleanor blinked. That used to be her, the one afraid her voice was too small, the one who needed someone to believe in her before she could believe in herself. And now, somehow, she was becoming that person for someone else. She smiled, not with pride, not even with certainty, but with something gentler like forgiveness. Maybe not for Charles, maybe not even for Margaret, but for herself, for staying too long, for leaving too late, for finally choosing peace over proof. That afternoon, as she cleaned out the supply closet, she found a small stack of blank note cards in a dusty tin. She wrote only 3 words on the first one, still standing, still caring. She taped it to the inside of the door. No one would see it right away, but someone would. And that was enough. The blueprint came in a plain envelope. No sender, no logo, no return address. Just one line, handwritten, across the bottom. Good ideas deserve a stage, especially when they come from quiet brilliance. Eleanor read it 3 times, then once more. She was alone in the conference room at the center, if one could call it a conference room. It was more like a storage closet with ambition. The table wobbled. The whiteboard had permanent marker stains. A broken mini fan sat in the corner, still collecting dust. And yet, here she was, holding something that looked like a dream turned into lines and angles and vision. The renovation blueprint was detailed, thoughtful, intimate. Every corner of the proposed design felt like someone had been watching not just the building, but its people. The layout preserved the natural light in the front room. It expanded the workshop space without sacrificing warmth. Even the paint colors, scribbled in a margin, reflected tones Eleanor once mentioned offhand: soft sage, warm cream, and a blue that reminded her of dusk over Lake Washington. But it was the note that undid her, not just the words, but the handwriting. It was neat, but not rigid, confident without being showy, familiar in a way she hadn't let herself think about in weeks. She didn't need a signature. She knew. Charles. She sat in her car for a long time after leaving the center that evening. The blueprint lay on the passenger seat, folded with care. Her fingers kept drifting toward it, tracing the edge of the envelope. Something about it felt like an apology, not the kind that comes with flowers or speeches, but the kind whispered by someone who finally understands what they almost lost. Still, she wasn't sure what to feel. Gratitude, anger, longing. They all swirled together like cream into black coffee, impossible to separate. He hadn't reached out, no calls, no emails, not even a reaction to her resignation. But then came the donation, the renovations, the grant, and now this. A quiet message dressed in blueprints and ink. The next morning, the air smelled of cinnamon and wood polish. The center's front desk was unusually tidy, as if someone had passed through early. Eleanor walked in late, balancing her tote bag and a stack of intake forms. The morning was already heavy with paperwork and plans, until she reached her desk and stopped. There it was, her coffee, exactly the way she liked it. Medium roast, splash of oat milk, dash of cinnamon, no sugar. In the same eco-friendly brown cup from the cafe across from Redstone Tech's downtown tower. The sleeve even had the same hand-drawn heart the barista used to doodle when she picked it up in person. She stood still. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up, brought it close. Still warm. She closed her eyes and inhaled, and for a moment the scent carried her back to quiet mornings, to unspoken nods, to the feeling of being seen. Only this time, it wasn't in a glass tower, surrounded by ambition. It was here, in a space built not for profit, but for purpose. A space she had helped shape with nothing but heart and stubborn hope. And someone had noticed. Someone still was noticing. She didn't say anything to the others. She tucked the blueprint into her drawer, drank her coffee slowly, and told herself it could be coincidence. Maybe the coffee shop started delivering. Maybe the note was just a kind stranger's gesture. Maybe she still wanted it to be him. Hope was a tricky thing. She had once said, She didn't need anyone to save her, and she still didn't. But that didn't mean she didn't want someone who chose to stand quietly in the wings, watching, remembering, believing even from afar. Someone who didn't need credit, just connection. That afternoon, as she packed up for the day, she found another note. This time, it was smaller, folded carefully and slipped under a stack of flyers on her desk. No envelope, no name. Just 3 words on plain white paper, written in the same familiar script, still listening, always. She didn't cry. She smiled, softly, like the kind of smile that comes after a long storm when the light breaks through just enough to warm your face. There were no promises, no declarations, just this presence. And sometimes that was more powerful than any spoken word. That evening, she didn't go straight home. She walked to the cafe instead, ordered 2 coffees, sat by the window, waited. Not for him, necessarily. Not for a dramatic moment or some cinematic confrontation, but for herself. To say, I'm still here. I haven't closed the door completely. Not yet. The bell above the door chimed now and then. Strangers came and went. The sun dipped low behind the skyline, painting the city in soft gold. He didn't show. And that was okay, because for now, she didn't need him to. She just needed to know he still saw her. And somehow, in notes without names and cups without explanations, he had told her that he did. Charles Whitmore never chased anyone, not in business, not in life, not even in love. But he didn't need to. His words, when he used them, stayed, long after he left the room, and sometimes so did his silence. When Eleanor left, she didn't slam doors. She didn't make a scene. No tears, no confrontation, no closure. Just a single-line resignation email and a quiet absence that echoed more than shouting ever could. The morning after she left, he found her key card sitting neatly on his assistant's desk. He stared at it for a long time. It looked small in his hand, lighter than it should have felt, but it carried the weight of everything he hadn't said. He kept her last note, that line. When the place you gave your best no longer sees you, it cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal he'd ever experienced, because she hadn't just left the company. She'd left believing she was invisible, and that he realized with sickening clarity was a failure on his part, not Margaret's, not the system's, his. He'd watched it happen, had let it happen, because somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that restraint was respect, that keeping distance meant keeping her safe. That quiet admiration was enough. It wasn't. Margaret's presence had complicated everything. She came in with her signature perfume and polished heels, already rewriting agendas before the ink on her contract was dry. He should have stopped it sooner. He hadn't, and Eleanor, fiercely competent, quietly loyal, and already fighting battles no one saw, was the one who paid for his indecision. It took 2 days after Eleanor left for him to terminate Margaret's consultancy agreement. She didn't go quietly, but she went. I was never the problem, she'd said, cold smile stretching too wide. You were always afraid of what you felt. He didn't argue, because maybe she wasn't wrong. In the weeks that followed, Charles found himself haunted by small things. The way Eleanor used to tilt her head when she was trying not to roll her eyes, the way she greeted the janitor by name, even on Mondays, the sticky notes she left on reports not because protocol demanded it, but because she knew someone might need clarity, the kind of care that didn't come with titles or expectations. He missed her, not just in meetings, not just in logistics, but in the way a room felt less steady when she wasn't in it. He had her email proposal saved, the one she'd sent weeks before leaving, tucked between finance reports and internal audits. He'd read it twice when it came in, had meant to reply, had even drafted a response. But then Margaret arrived, and things unraveled, and silence took over. Now, he read it again, and this time, he acted. He routed funds quietly through a shell foundation. No names, no credits, no fingerprints. The blueprint commissioned with one instruction: follow her ideas. The coffee delivery arranged through an old favor with a barista who owed him for helping secure a visa. The notes, written in the quietest corner of his home, late at night, pen shaking just slightly. He didn't need her to come back. He just needed her to know she'd been seen, truly, deeply, maybe too late, but not too little. Some nights, he drove past the center, lights dim, but still glowing. Once, he saw her through the glass laughing. Not the polite office laugh. Not the, "I'm still holding it together" laugh. A real one. Her shoulders were relaxed, her face soft, her hands gesturing in mid-story. She looked free, and in that moment, he understood something Eleanor had likely known all along. Love doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is step aside and let someone become who they were meant to be, even if it's without you. Still, he had one last thing to give. A letter. Just a few lines. No declarations. No apologies. Because Eleanor didn't need apologies. She needed honesty. So, he wrote, "Marry me or don't. I will still be here. I will still believe in your dreams. I will still love you quietly if that's what you need. But know this, you changed everything about how I see the world." And then, underneath, almost like a whisper, "Coffee tomorrow, name order, same time, same quiet conversation that feels like coming home." He folded the note carefully, slid it into a plain white envelope, and had it delivered in the most ordinary way possible. No flowers, no fanfare, just faith that she would read it, that she would understand, and that maybe, just maybe, the silence between them had always been a kind of music. They'd just never learned how to dance to it. Until now, it wasn't written on gold-foiled paper. There was no diamond ring tucked inside. No orchestrated flash mob, no staged photos, no background music, just a folded note, placed quietly, intentionally, between two children's books, Where the Wild Things Are and The Giving Tree, on the shelf closest to her desk. Eleanor found it as she was closing up the community center for the night. The halls were quiet now, echoes of children's laughter still clinging faintly to the painted walls. She had just turned off the main lights when the corner of a white envelope caught her eye. Her fingers reached for it automatically, before her brain caught up. As soon as she touched the paper, she knew. The thickness, the fold, the steady, careful handwriting. Her heart reacted faster than her thoughts. It fluttered just once, then stilled, as if bracing for something too fragile to name. She slid her finger beneath the fold and opened it. A single sheet. And on it, these words, "Marry me or don't. I will still be here. I will still believe in what you're building. I will still love you quietly if that's what you need. But know this, you changed everything about how I see the world." There was a pause inside her, like the breath between thunder and rain. She read it again, slower this time, letting the meaning settle. This wasn't a demand, not a fairy tale. It wasn't even a question, really. It was a promise, a gentle one, offered with open hands. And then, beneath the words, an afterthought. But the most important part, coffee tomorrow, name order same time. Same quiet conversation that feels like coming home. Eleanor sat down on the nearest bench. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered once before fading completely, leaving her in the soft glow of the security lamps by the window. Outside, the evening was damp. Streetlights cast their glow across slick pavement. Rain threatened, but hadn't yet fallen. She read the note again, and again. No signature. None needed. She knew, and more than that, she felt seen in a way that didn't make her shrink or question her worth. Charles wasn't asking her to return to the company, or to become someone else. He was offering space, to belong, to choose, to continue being who she was, without compromise. And in that freedom, there was tenderness. She thought back to all the things he'd never said, the coffee that always arrived on time, the suggestions he'd implemented without crediting her publicly, but always respectfully, the way he had never interrupted her mid-sentence, even when others did. He had listened with his actions, cared in silence. Now, this note, simple as it was his first loud gesture. But even so, it was quiet in its own way. No pressure, no deadline, just hope. Her thumb brushed over the crease of the paper. She noticed the faintest indentation where the pen had pressed harder, just beneath the word believe. It struck her, suddenly, how vulnerable that word was in his handwriting. Charles Whitmore didn't ask for things. He delegated, he planned, he acted, but this wasn't strategy. This was surrender, and that made it all the more profound. Eleanor leaned back and closed her eyes. She remembered their first conversation, that standoff in the executive corridor. Her voice raised, his unreadable expression, the feeling of heat in her cheeks, and the steel in her spine. She remembered the business card, the surprise, the shame, and how, instead of anger, he had answered with grace. It had started there, and in every moment since, something had been building. Not romance in the traditional sense, not flowers or dates or whispered declarations, but respect, consistency, depth. And now, she realized, maybe love had been quietly living between them all along. She left the center with the letter still in hand. The rain had started soft and steady. It clung to her coat and dampened her curls, but she didn't pull up her hood. Instead, she walked slowly, letting the water wash away the last remnants of fear, of doubt, of the version of herself who once believed she had to earn love through perfection. This love, whatever it was becoming, didn't ask her to perform, only to be at home. She lit a candle, not because she needed light, but because it felt like a ritual, something sacred. She placed the letter next to her tea, still in its envelope. No plans to answer tonight. She didn't need to. Some answers lived in the way your body leaned forward without you realizing, in the warmth that stayed in your chest long after reading something once. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the soft chime of a bell above a cafe door, 2 coffees, a table in the corner, and maybe, just maybe, a future that didn't have to be loud to be real. She looked out her window. The rain glistened against the street lamps. The world looked washed clean. And somewhere in the rhythm of falling drops, she heard something steady, a heart, hers, choosing, softly, willingly. Finally, 2 cups, 1 newspaper, and a seat across from him. That's all it took to rewrite everything. Eleanor stood just inside the cafe door, rain still clinging to her coat sleeves. The air inside was warm with the scent of toasted bread, cinnamon, and something gentler memory, maybe. There he was, at the same table near the window, facing the same street. But somehow, everything was different now. Charles Whitmore didn't look up right away. He was stirring his coffee slowly, a quiet rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with waiting. Waiting without expectation. Waiting like someone who knew hope was fragile and still worth holding. Eleanor's feet moved before she told them to. Step by step across the worn wooden floor, past the counter, past the shelves of local pastries and handmade mugs. When she reached the table, he finally looked up, storm-gray eyes, steady and tired. Not from work, but from missing, from wondering if silence had said too much or not enough. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. No words. Not yet. The second cup of coffee was still warm. She picked it up, took a sip, and that was the beginning. They sat for a long time in the comfort of shared quiet, the kind of silence that asked nothing, offered everything. Outside, the city moved buses, bicycles, people wrapped in scarves. Inside, the world paused. Eleanor studied his face. There were lines now she hadn't noticed before, not from age, but from carrying too much alone. But beneath it all, he was still the man who fixed her computer without asking. Still the man who read every one of her proposals. Still the man who never once asked her to be smaller than she was. He had let her leave, but he had also made sure her work lived on. The foundation she now helped build at the community center was no longer a side project. Thanks to anonymous support and one unspoken promise, it was now a lifeline for dozens of women like her. He didn't ask her to say thank you. He never would. But she said it anyway, softly. I know it was you. Charles nodded once. He didn't deny it. You didn't try to stop me, she added. No, he said, you needed to go. And now he looked out the window. Rain streaked down the glass in silver trails. Now I'm just here, he said, still believing. That was the moment. Not a grand confession, not a cinematic speech. Just two people sitting across from each other, realizing that love had been the quiet thing between them all along. Not the storm, but the shelter. Not the fire, but the warmth that stayed. Eleanor reached across the table. Her fingers touched his, not in a gesture of ownership, but of recognition. I'm not the same person who left, she whispered. I know, he replied, and you're not as cold as you pretend to be. He gave a small smile, the kind that started in the corners of his eyes. Never was. For the first time in months, she laughed. Not loud, not bright, but real. The waitress came by, refilled their cups, smiled like she'd seen this story before, and maybe she had. Maybe everyone had. Two people, one table, 1,000 unsaid things finally settling. They talked then, about little things, work, weather, books, about the new mentorship program Eleanor was building. She mentioned a girl named Mia, 16, curious, afraid to speak too loud. Charles listened, really listened, then said, you give people a voice. You gave me the space to use it. For a second, neither spoke, because that was the truth. The bridge, the quiet miracle of it all. As the afternoon light shifted, Eleanor folded the note, the one he'd sent, and placed it gently on the table between them. No answer, she said. Not yet. That's okay, he replied. I wasn't looking for an answer. She tilted her head. Then why ask? He looked at her, then really looked, and said, because even if you never say yes, I still wanted you to know what was true. And there it was. Love. Uncomplicated, undefended, offered, not imposed. They left the cafe together, no hands held, but their footsteps matched, like they always had, ever since the first day he walked past her desk without a word, and she made sure he never did that again. Now, they walked side by side, still no promises, still no ring, but everything real. A few weeks later, Eleanor added a new quote to the wall of the community center, right by the front door so everyone would see it on their way in. Painted in soft gray letters, it read, "Sometimes. The most powerful love stories begin not with a kiss, but with a quiet, you can't walk in without permission." And below it, in a frame, hung the first proposal letter she'd ever received. No names, just words, and the life they helped her build. Sometimes, the most meaningful connections are not built through grand declarations, but through quiet acts of respect, kindness, and seeing each other fully, flaws and all. Eleanor's story reminds us that strength often looks like stillness, that choosing dignity over drama and purpose over pride is its own kind of courage. In a world that values speed, noise, and appearances, there's something deeply human about moving slowly, listening closely, and loving gently. Charles didn't win Eleanor's heart by chasing her. He honored her by stepping back, by supporting her dreams even when she walked away. And Eleanor, in turn, learned that it's okay to rebuild to start again when a place no longer makes room for your voice. For anyone who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this story is a quiet reminder your presence matters, your ideas matter, and sometimes the right people will see your worth without you ever needing to prove it. In the end, the love that lasts isn't loud. It's steady, patient, and deeply kind. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, even in the smallest way, we'd be so grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Every gesture of support helps us continue bringing you stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take care of yourself and those quiet moments that matter most. See you in the next story.